Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started at the top of the clock at noon. I see lots of people logging on, which is fantastic. And just briefly, and we'll do this properly in a second, but my name is Bill Dempster and longtime collaborator with and client of CORD, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, and just thrilled again to help out on this webinar. We're going to get started in 30 seconds now that we are at the top of the hour, but this is the time when I ask people who are online to put a question in the panel for the GoToWebinar so that we can actually quickly test some of the tech on your end and welcome the attendees that way. So can I please ask one of my friends to type a quick question in the GoToWebinar panel box? Because that's what we're going to depend on. The chat panel is working. This is the only tech that we're going to be using. So as some of you know from previous webinars, sometimes we show videos, sometimes we show animated slides. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in yet. If I know people on the line and you actually have access to my cell phone number, just text me and say this. Oh, there we go. We've got somebody from Vancouver. And Dennis, I don't normally identify people, so you don't know which Dennis I'm talking about, but great to see you. And I'm doing fine, thank you. A good friend from Montreal just logged on. Okay, so we're going to get started. Today's the second webinar in this 3-webinar series on the PMPRB changes. Today's webinar is called Hearing from Those Who Really Matter. We have almost 200 people who registered, which is an incredible turnout for a webinar in the middle of the summer. So thank you all for coming. The Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders would like to thank Roche, Janssen, and AstraZeneca for in part supporting this webinar series. So a special shout out to them and thank you for that. And just before I introduce the panel and what we're going to talk through today, I'd actually like to pass it over to Durhan Wong-Rieger, the President and CEO of CORD, who will situate this webinar where we are and where we're going to go. So over to you, Durhan.
So thank you very, very much, first of all, to Bill and to 360 for their continuous support for CORD and for all the things that we do. We certainly wouldn't be able to do this without, your not just your moderating skills, but all your organization skills. This is the second in our summer series. Those of you who have been with us for our spring series, this was, that was done before the revised guidelines came out, and we really wanted to make sure that we were able to discuss the revised guidelines as they've come out. I think others of you have heard me say in the past, really, this was not what we intended to do this summer, but we felt it was essential, because these new guidelines, these new regulations have such a huge impact in terms of patients, and not just patients with rare diseases, but all patients who are looking for new medicines coming into Canada. We also would like to really, first of all, I'd really like to thank this panel. It gets more exciting almost every time that we do it. And we seem to be able to get some amazing people who have amazing expertise and experiences to come and join us. So that's really a credit, I think, to people's engagements, even as Bill says, in the summertime. What we want to do is we're responding now in between what will be the final submissions to CADTH with regard to the revised guidelines and the series of forums that they've been having, both in order to do a Q&A with public and industry on the guidelines, but also to situate some of the background or some of the impact of that might be. So those of you may have been participating in some of the PMPRB sessions then. Really, for us, what we would have preferred is to have an interactive session, with the members of not only the PMPRB, but other policymakers, other payers, and really make this truly, a dialogue, a discussion, because at the end of the day, this affects all of us, and we all have to be on the same page in order for this to work. Unfortunately, that's not the way in which the consultations have been set up. It's really been very much one-way dialogue, so that's unfortunate. but we'll do the best we can with it. And this one really is to talk about what we heard in the previous forums that the PMPRB hosted, and really what we want to be able to also say in response to that. So this is really important for us in order to also, respond to some of the presentations that have been made. I would also like to acknowledge that we at least have seen on our registration some of the staff from the PMPRB who are listening in, which we think is really valuable, and we appreciate that very much in terms of also listening to us, as I know we have eagerly listened to you. So with that as a very brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who's going to, I want to recap, sorry. So this is where we've been in the past. These are the recommendations that we made going in. I think what you will see here is that what we have been hoping is that we can position the PMPRB to actually be working towards the goal that we all talk about, and that is affordable medicines for everybody. We recognize and acknowledge, the desire to actually lower, the overall price of or the budget impact in terms of medicines, but we really feel that that has to be done within the context of making sure we continue to have access to the best medicines and have access to new medicines. And that is one of the reasons why this is so very important today, is to really be able to put that back into context as well. What is the impact in terms of patient access? What is the impact in terms of industry and their willingness to participate under the proposed guidelines? And to make sure that we're not only going to be able to look at pricing as an important measure, but that we're actually focusing on what we all believe is very important, and that is for patients to continue to have access. So with that, I'm going to, I think, turn it back over to Bill, who is going to, I think we've done all this, who's going to actually introduce the panel and the agenda for today.
And thanks so much, Durhan. Just one thing on this last context slide. A reminder to folks that the PMPRB has given stakeholders until August 4th to develop written input and participate in a number of research webinars and public webinars and whatnot. There's a lot of information that's up and online, both from them, but we're hoping as well that webinars like this, which will be posted online afterwards on CORE's YouTube channel and SlideShare, will give stakeholders more information from which to prepare their submissions to engage with the PMPRB, and hopefully help them continue to evolve the guidelines and how they're operationalizing these changes. So thank you, Durhan, and I'd like to introduce our panel. We do have one panelist that we're crossing our fingers and toes who's going to be able to sign on. So I'm going to keep an eye out for that to happen, and that might happen just a little bit later. And of course, that's hearing from a clinician, somebody who's treating, especially in the cancer space. But he did have a clinic today and was going to really try to squeeze in this webinar. So heads up if another person jumps onto the webinar, I'll introduce him briefly. But we're really thrilled to have Lindy Forte with Patient Access Solutions, who is actually going to do a very short presentation to walk through some of what we've heard on the research webinar on drugs for rare diseases recently from the PMPRB. We've got Barbara Yezhevsky with Advisor Cloud, and she's a past global vice president of pricing and market access. And a lot of you know Barb from her time with Bayer or Lundbeck Global, like a truly international perspective on how these might work or might not work or be perceived from the industry's perspective, and really following this issue very closely as well. Dr. Sandy Sadev is a medical oncologist at the Ottawa Hospital Cancer Center, and he's been watching this issue as well as a treater and a prescriber. We're just thrilled to have with us Catherine Boivin, who is an SMA patient. So thank you, Catherine, for joining us. And I know you've been actually engaging with your member of parliament on this already. And you've already met Durhan. And again, my name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs. and I'll do my best to direct traffic because we're going to spend a lot of time in a round table as opposed to just a didactic presentation. But just 2 slides to situate where we are. The PMPRB has held a number of webinars so far. They did one with industry on June 29th, with the public on July 8th, which we're open to all interested stakeholders. They've got one more research webinar that they're calling it. It's actually this afternoon at 1:30 on drug shortages. I'm just showing you a couple of screenshots from this, and recommend you go just Google PMPRB and you'll come up on this consultation draft guidelines website, and you'll see a lot of this data. We're going to spend a bit more time on the insight into spending on expensive drugs for rare diseases, which happened on June 23rd. But I'll let Lindy walk through a little bit more on what that webinar entailed. Really briefly, what we've heard so far on the webinars. Again, Lindy will go through what we heard on the expensive drugs for rare diseases webinar and actually present some of the data that she's developed and her team at Patient Access Solutions has developed to provide a bit of a counterpoint on that. There was a subsequent webinar on market size of patented medicines in Canada. And actually, I just saw this recently with the Canadian Health and Life Insurers put up a submission to the Health Committee and mentioned that, a small percentage of medicines are actually accounting for a large part of their expenditures. And this is what the market size of patented medicines question often asks. We could ask the same thing of the entire health system. There's a lot of the health system is focused on end-of-life care and beginning-of-life care. And I think what Durhan, you mentioned earlier is, let's talk about how we're improving the lives of those small number of Canadians that we're spending more on, and how we can do that well. And I think that's hopefully what's going to come through with some of the discussion on this. The question about drug pricing and its impact on R&D investments, clinical trials, and availability of medicines in Canada. The last webinar we had, we actually had Jason Field from Life Sciences Ontario bring forward some new data that what they're seeing in terms of what's actually sold on the market versus what's just come through Health Canada in terms of approval. And there is a disconnect there. And I think that a lot of that disconnect is happening because manufacturers don't know what their price is going to be. And so, yes, they might get through Health Canada, but no, they can't actually sell it here because it's not very clear in terms of what they could actually charge without actually being brought before the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, which is a quasi-judicial body that actually has the power of law behind it. It's like a superior court, and it regulates these ceiling prices. And what we've seen is that these changes have had a very marked impact already on availability of medicines for Canadian patients, on clinical trials. And when I'm talking about clinical trials, I'm talking about phase 2 and 3 trials that a lot of, especially rare disease patients and cancer patients depend on, and R&D investments. We're going to hear more about drug shortages today from the PMPRB, so it'll be very interesting to hear on that one. Just a couple things on the public webinar. They talked about international examples, the use of economic factors, being very common elsewhere. And I would just say, well, that's true. It's never used in the sense of a regulator. Economic factors are never used to bring the maximum ceiling price down without that funding or as part of a public drug program. We've already talked about impact to access on medicines and clinical trials. There was a specific call out on one slide on new medicines for cystic fibrosis. And one other perspective on that is that they took all of the patients. I don't know if Durhan, you want to talk about that one briefly before we get into the panel discussion? I thought I heard you wanted to jump in there.
No, I was just hoping I think we should just move on and get into Lindy's presentation because we're going to run out of time.
You got it, yeah. And then they had a few case studies with that we think actually starts at the point where they're going to start regulating the maximum rebated price. We can come back to that if the discussion allows. Okay, Lindy, over to you. Bring out some insights on spending on drugs for rare diseases. Let me know when you want to change slides. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you very much to CORD for inviting us to be part of today's webinar. I want to give a shout out to my team at Patient Access Solutions. While I'm the spokesperson, I am not the super smart team of market access professionals that has pulled all of this data together and all of these insights. So shout out to them, and I know many of them are listening today. Next slide, please. What I plan to do today is to provide a very brief overview of the PMPRB report on the insight into the spending on expensive drugs for rare diseases for people that might not have been able to attend the webinar when that was presented or to see the report that's available online. I'll let you know what we did hear from that report and what some of the takeaway messages are. I'm also going to provide an alternate perspective on what we did not hear. Then we will move to an analysis that our team has put together on the projected cost of drugs for rare diseases in Canada. We presented our analysis at ISPOR in November, and that poster and research was received very well. I'm also going to provide perspective on the cost of drugs for rare diseases in Canada relative to other expenditures. And then later, after a panel presentation, we'll talk about where we can go from here. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of an overview of the report, and I have to disclose that I wasn't intimately involved in the analysis, obviously, and I only have the details that are available in the report. But from the report, it says that expensive drugs for rare diseases are defined as having at least one orphan designation through FDA or EMA. And they also have a relatively high cost, so over $100,000 per patient per year for non-cancer drugs, or a per cycle cost of $7,500 or more for the oncology drugs. They looked at annual per patient costs. Presumably they were obtained from CADTH reports, although it wasn't entirely obvious, but I'm assuming that's where it came from. And then finally, they looked at IQVIA data from 2009 to 2019, looking at the total expenditure on these drugs. Next slide, please. So what does the report say? I have to say, we completely understand the perspective of PMPRB and what their mandate is. It's to make sure that Canadians are not paying more than they should be for new drugs. And but what we found with the report is that there's some very quite scary language in the report, and to the untrained individuals, they might be really shocked by the report. So for example, orphan medicines are increasingly dominating the new drug landscape. They're pushing the limits of affordability. They have limited or unclear therapeutic benefit. They're not cost effective. Canada's spending is above OECD norms. Those are pretty powerful messages and could likely make individuals fearful that drug manufacturers are taking advantage of Canadian payers. Next slide, please. Here is one of the key takeaway slides from that report. There's a lot of information on the slide, but one of the takeaways for me, you can see the yellow boxes. My understanding is that those boxes represent the proportion of total drug spending in Canada that the drugs for rare diseases are responsible for. So if you look to the 2019 column, Canadians are spending 2.5% of the total budget on drugs for rare diseases. Below the 2.5%, in the blue bar, you can see 6.9% is spent on oncology drugs for rare conditions. And you can see the upward trajectory there. It appears that the costs are increasing year over year, and this could be frightening to some. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to present some of the context that is not available in the report. And this is, the purpose of presenting this is to present an alternate view that considers the perspective of patients and their caregivers, and also provide some insights into some of the things that go on behind the scenes. So the figures that you saw on the previous slide regarding 2.5% of expenditure on the total budget, that really reflects the list prices. And I'll get to it later, but you'll see that those aren't the prices that are necessarily paid. So in terms of challenging the statement that orphan medicines are dominating the landscape, one thing that's not there is the perspective, again, of the patients and their caregivers. So there's no comment on innovation and the fact that these diseases were previously untreated. Patients and caregivers see these drugs as life-changing or life-extending. So if you look to the CADTH review reports where patient input is sought and published, you can see that these drugs are incredibly important for patients. I also want to say that this PMPRB report has lumped together drugs for rare diseases, orphan drugs, so drugs that really have are targeted to one indication, patients generally speaking with a genetic defect that causes the disease, and they've lumped them together with the targeted cancer drugs. When we split out the bucket of 93 drugs, we found that 42 were for truly orphan drugs, while 51 were for cancer indications. And the reason why we separated out is because while a drug might come to market for a rare cancer, over time, generally these drugs are tested in other cancers. Indications are added to the product monograph and to the approvals in Canada, and the market for those drugs is extended or expands, especially in oncology, where over time more and more people are getting diagnosed with cancer. So we felt it was important to separate out the truly drugs for rare disease, orphan indications. In terms of pushing the limit of affordability. So again, I mentioned that these 42 drugs account for only 2.5% of pharmaceutical sales in Canada. And what is not stated in that report is the fact that private insurance actually covers up to 40% of the costs of drugs for rare diseases or more. So from the PMPRB perspective, they have to look at the cost for all Canadians, but the general public should know that employers are making decisions that these drugs are important to pay for. They're adding them to their benefits plans, and over time, as the public insurance comes on board, even still, the private insurers cover a great deal of the cost of these drugs. Again, I hinted at the fact that the list prices are not the prices paid. There are confidential agreements in place, and this is going on around the world. This is not unique to Canada. Payers, in fact, are involved in the collaborative decision-making that goes on with regard to what is the value of this new drug relative to what's currently available and what is the appropriate price to pay. I also want to highlight that what's also missing perspective is that the annual cost of DRDs, which is about $280 million annually at last count, truly pales in comparison with the cost of other healthcare buckets that people don't seem to be complaining about too much. At least it's not in the media as much as potentially the cost of drugs for rare diseases. So what is the annual cost of smoking related illness? $6.5 billion. Annual cost of obesity, caring for obesity and all of the downstream health conditions that occur, it's been estimated at $8.8 billion annually for 2021. So those are huge numbers, and the cost of DRDs pales in comparison to those numbers. Next slide, please. Another statement from the PMPRB report that we'd like to provide an alternate perspective on is the fact that it was stated that often these drugs for rare diseases come with limited or unclear therapeutic benefit. We'd like to highlight the fact that that is one perspective to take, but from Health Canada's perspective, these drugs are most commonly approved through expedited review mechanisms, meaning that they're seen as drugs where there are no available treatment alternatives in Canada. So those two viewpoints are quite diametrically opposed. Speaking about the unclear therapeutic benefit, that often occurs because they are very small trials. There are some drugs in Canada that have been approved, and there are literally 10 patients in Canada with the condition. Worldwide, I'm not sure what that translates to, but it's very challenging to find the patients to enroll into the trials, and they take a long time. I also want to highlight that, unfortunately, the way that the PMPRB is publishing their reports, there's not a consistent publication, and so there's some lack of transparency in the therapeutic designation. We've seen some reports come where the staff and the expert individuals that are put together to do the research to come up with recommendations often see these drugs as breakthroughs, and then when the information goes to the expert panel, the HDAP, they come back with a lesser designation. So sometimes a moderate benefit, and there isn't really enough transparency, and those reports aren't published online, so it's quite hard to challenge them. Finally, when we look at the comment around spending above the OECD norm, there was a beautiful graphic in the report. I haven't shown it here, but if we look at just the expenditure on the orphan drugs only and not focus on the cancer, we see that in fact the width of the bar, it appears that Canada would actually fall at the midpoint or below even on drugs for rare disease spending. And we wonder about, the context of the heredity of these conditions. Is the expenditure on drugs for rare diseases in each country in line with the heterogeneity or the homogeneity of the population? So are we seeing a higher expenditure in Canada because there is unmet medical need here, where there are more individuals, just purely based on our heterogeneous population and the immigration that has occurred? Next slide, please. So very quickly, I'll present our analysis of the DRD costs in Canada. And much like the PMPRB, much like the payers in Canada, we are also curious about what is the current expenditure on DRDs relative to the total drug expenditure, and what does the pathway look like when you consider pipeline drugs. For the purpose of today's conversation and providing balance with the PMPRB report, I'll just focus on current expenditure, but we are working on updating our analysis for the future pipeline as well. So as I stated before, we really feel that the cancer drugs should be looked at differently. Absolutely should look at costs to make sure they're appropriate and they're in line with what's being done around the world. But our focus has really been on the orphan designation, because they generally are indicated for one disease only. Next slide, please. I also want to highlight that we looked at this from the public payer perspective. As I said, employers have made the assessment that it's important to provide health benefits to patients. They're fully engaged. We meet with them on a regular basis. They're adding new drugs to their formularies all the time. They've become very creative. They're mobilizing to pool their resources to make sure that they're sharing. And with a genetic disorder, you wouldn't want all of the expenditure to fall on one plan or on one insurer. So they've gotten really smart about pooling their resources to ensure that they can continue to supplement the drug programs that we have here in Canada. The cost of drugs that was not available in the claims data, and a shout out to my friends at PDCI that helped us procure this data. Unlike the PMPRB, where claims data were not available because of the unique pathways of funding for some of the drugs, we actually went to the provinces and did a freedom of information request so that our analysis could be as robust as possible. We also included the cost of quote, non-expensive drugs. And we don't like to use the term expensive drugs for rare diseases. We just talk about drugs for rare diseases. We really are passionate about this and want to ensure that Canadians can continue to have access to these drugs where there's no other alternatives. And so there are a number of them in the database where the annual costs are actually far below $100,000 per year, and we've included those. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here is our finding. We looked again through the claims data, the approvals and reimbursement of the drugs for rare diseases over time. You can see for sure there's a growth in the curve there as new medications become available and new patients get diagnosed with the condition. These are lifelong treatments, so over time the curve is going to grow. We found that in 2019, the public expenditure was $280 million in the DRDs. Next slide, please. In terms of total expenditure relative to all drugs, DRDs relative to all drugs, the expenditure in 2019 was 1.9%. This is not very different actually from what the PMPRB found, which they reported to be 2.5%. In our preliminary analysis, we can see growth year over year. We're going to be updating this work based on what drugs were in our pipeline before and have now come to market. But you can see there's a relatively modest growth there. Next slide, please. And then potentially most importantly, we wanted to put the cost of drugs for rare diseases into context of other expenditures. I mentioned before that the total direct healthcare costs of smoking-related illnesses are $6.5 billion. That's billion with a B, and that's annual. Obesity-related illness is $8.8 billion annually. When you look at on the far left of this graphic, public expenditure on the DRDs, again, $1 million. Contrast that with spending on top 10 cosmetic procedures, $1.5 billion annually in Canada. Expenditures on alcohol, $22.5 billion, and that's pre-COVID alcohol. And then when you look at the total bucket of public healthcare spending, we have an amazing healthcare system in Canada. We're spending a lot of money. It's universal. We really have the ethics around ensuring that all Canadians have, as to the best of our ability, equal access to the medications and the treatments that they need for their individual conditions. I think that is a value of Canadians, and we want to make sure that value is realized. Next slide, please.
So thanks so much, Lindy. That was I mean, we're going to save one more slide for you, I think, towards the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly so that we can go to another view. I hope everyone can see folks on the GoToWebinar now. Everyone should be there. I think I've got a problem on my end in terms of what it looks like, but that might be the internet. I want to throw this out first to Barbara, based on what Lindy shared with us and your experience globally. What do you think? How do you think companies will look at Canada based on these guidelines?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, there's no doubt, as I put on my LinkedIn yesterday, that the whole world is really watching, the implementation of these guidelines. It captured quite a lot of attention globally. I think because the changes are, in the first instance, at least, extremely large relative to where they were before. I think what is a real challenge for a global team is, they're trying to understand all the different health systems. And Canada is one of the more complex health systems to understand. So it's often mentioned that what pharma wants, and indeed what the provinces really want, is predictability. And that is, more difficult now to get that predictability. So it's putting a lot of weight on the shoulders of the market access team in Canada. They are a market access team. They're not a no access team. So their job is to get that product into the country. And the stakes have become higher to convince their global colleagues, for sure.
Thanks, Barbara. And I know, Dr. Sadab, you joined us, and you probably, I think you still have a hard stop at 1:45. So I really do have to turn to you and get your perspective on this. Just thank you for joining us. You've raised some concerns regarding the draft guidelines at a recent CORD event, actually, in Ottawa. And based on what you heard from Lindy and Barb and Durhan earlier, do you share some of those concerns? And how do you think the PMPRB might influence access to clinical research that you depend on, or even medicines that you use in the clinic?
First of all, I found Lindy. Can you hear me okay? It's a funny 100%. Microphone here. So I found the presentation wonderful. I took notes during your presentation because I learned a lot from that. But I mean, it's very frustrating, right? So I almost don't know where to start. I have a flashback to once when Doug Clark at PMPRB basically acknowledged that the whole process has been steamrolled through faster than any of us would like. And he basically said they're going to throw it against the wall and wait for complaints and evidence-based comments to come back and look at revising things afterwards. And I think he basically acknowledged, quite honestly, the impact on cancer patients could be quite severe, but that it would be a short-term impact for a year or two until we started complaining and tried to fix things. And I was quite shocked. I mean, it was an open acknowledgement that there's going to be problems for us. And for 1 or 2 years, that's so many thousands of patients that will die that could have benefited from our treatments. I think a lot of the points you made, Lindy, about the rare diseases and the limitations of data and how they say they're not fully evidence-based, almost every cancer is becoming a rare disease now because we're able to understand more the differing molecular drivers behind every unique cancer in different patients. That's why I had to quit my old job in Toronto, treating every kind of cancer, so I could just handle the waterfall of data and focus just on 2 kinds of cancers now in my job in Ottawa. I'm actually very frightened. There's breakthroughs coming through all the time that are not just 3 months longer survival or better quality of life, but meaningful length, median survival benefits of a year or 2. And some of them already have Health Canada approval for other indications, and hopefully will sneak by this. But if they were coming to us now, I don't see they would come to us for at least 2 or 3 more years. I know we had some examples, I won't get into them now, but there are drugs that Roche had for cancer where they've actually withdrawn their application to the process. I think the point you made too about how we don't actually pay list price. No one pays list price. We're getting, confidential price listing agreements. We're getting pretty good value. All those things are really very impactful. The biggest impact I've had when talking with media sometimes or patient advocates is just saying, look, today, as of this rule going into force, there will be drugs that companies won't bother launching. There are some now in bladder cancer that are considered last ditch, but they're so effective, they're moving up to first line. Bladder cancer, very common cancer that we're not going to have. And there's no plans to launch it in Canada. And they've already been on the market for a year in the US. So I think, maybe from my point of view, from advocacy, corralling those specific examples, I think we talked before, Bill, about even doing like an op-ed focused on cancer. I think the whole media blitz recently about the cystic fibrosis drug has been very successful. As a layperson watching it, I was shocked and alarmed at the impact of this on the CF patients. So I was almost hoping to ride on those coattails and kind of take the next step to broaden the perspective. The COVID piece also has given us an opportunity to say, look at the billions we're spending on COVID, and look how many magnitudes of order, more patients are dying of cancers that won't be able to get the benefits of therapy for a much smaller investment. So right now, I think the impact on research is real. I think people brush it off. They say it's a pharma tactic and not to, listen to that. I don't think research studies will launch in Canada. I don't think we'll get compassionate access to drugs after this goes through, because they're committed to providing compassionate access often for years until we wait for listing in the country. So I guess that's, my perspective. I think the bladder cancer drug, the enfortumab vedotin, one called avelumab, as a maintenance therapy in bladder cancer, like an added survival of more than a year and a half. All these treatments, TBM1, we just got funded in breast cancer, would not have sneaked through the pipe based on the new criteria. Is considered the biggest advance in curing breast cancer, high-risk breast cancer in the last 10 years. So I can think of many examples like that, but I really fear for what's going to happen once this goes through.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sadev. Catherine, we'll turn it to you, and then it's an open field. Please feel free to jump in. You've been a vocal advocate for SMA, and you've benefited from the first medicine for your neurological condition, and you were able to get Spinraza through the exceptional patient access program in Quebec. So from what we've been talking through so far, the PMPRB changes would probably block access to a new therapy for SMA, for rare diseases, and for cancers, as we've just talked through. And what would that mean for you? And what would you want to tell the PMPRB as an agency, but the government more broadly on that point?
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks, Lindy, for your presentation. I was so relieved to finally hear, someone speaking for the voice of the patients, because that is what I feel was lacking the most. And what I've seen from the PMPRB, currently in rare disease, we're already having to fight for access to treatment, and yet we do have a voice in the current way things are happening in the negotiations. We currently have the possibility to have, patient input on outcomes and on what these therapies mean for us in our day-to-day life. So what's going to happen to that space if the PMPRB regulations come into force? Will we still have that opportunity to speak up and to say, well, look, this drug could mean a difference between being able to work and not being able to work, in my case. Or, for young children with SMA1, it's basically a death sentence up until now. And, 30 years ago, my family was part of the first genetic research that was being done on SMA in Canada, here in Quebec. And I never thought that in my lifetime we would see treatments at the end of the road. And 30 years later, we have one that's already approved partially in Canada, but we have others also coming up. And those are extremely important, because not only, you have the first breakthrough life-saving therapy, but, to have options down the road where, if one treatment doesn't work for certain patients, or, cannot be administered to certain patients because some therapies need to be administered, so much earlier on in the progression of the disease, well, what's going to happen to those options? Are we going to have access to those options? And the question of can you access, we talk a lot about it, but it's not, we're not trying to be unreachable when we talk about how important it is for us to access these therapies as early as possible. For some, it's a question of, life and death, literally. And for others, it's a question of, irreversible progression. The earlier you can get a certain treatment, the more effective it will be. So the more it will, influence your quality of life, your ability to have a productive life in society. So those, where are those taken into consideration in the new guidelines. Those are real fears and real concerns for patients with rare disease.
And thanks so much, Catherine. And the way that you're framing that as a question and you know, challenging this, but in a way that's constructive and about your life and those in the SMA community and beyond. Maybe, you know, back to Durhan. I mean, what do you think about what you've heard so far? And I know we're going to talk about, you know, next steps and where can we go? What are the sum ups of what Lindy's data says? And we'll turn back to Lindy. But any first reactions from you on what we've talked about so far?
You know, every time we do this, I always think that, okay, we've kind of got a handle in terms of what the challenges are. And every time we get other experts or patients like Catherine talking about it, we realize how really, really, you know, distressing this is and the huge impact it's going to have. I'm even, you know, it's chilling when you hear it in terms of when Dr. Sandeep is talking about, you know, what's the impact in terms of patients. And we work with those cancer patients, right, who are waiting for that next therapy. Or we talk, you know, as Catherine says, sure, we have a drug now, but quite frankly, we might not have got it. And Quebec may not have even had the opportunity to provide, you know, that drug through the, you know, the passion d'exception, if in fact the price had already been capped way before it even got there. So I think it's a huge concern for us. And I guess, you know, we are very, very, I think, concerned that this kind of a dialogue should actually have been a dialogue as part of the discussion. You know that I sat on the steering committee, you know, to look at the first draft guidelines, and we begged for case studies. And then when we finally got some case studies at the end is when PMPRB said, oh my gosh, we didn't realize it was going to have such a draconian impact. That's when they went back and changed some of the benchmarks. So from 30K to 60K to whatever. And we're basically saying, how can you put people's lives at risk like this? How can you actually say, and you know, when Sandy, you're saying, well, throw it on the wall and see kind of what sticks. You're not throwing spaghetti on the wall. You're throwing patients' lives on the walls. You're throwing patients under the bus. You know, do you not know these are real people that are at risk here? So I think that's really the concern. We have not had this kind of dialogue. And I'm so afraid. We wrote back to the PMPRB and said, if we provide you with, you know, feedback on your draft guidelines, what are you going to do? Are we going to have another round of consultations? Do you just go back and say, thank you very much? I guess I might just ask Barb, you know, based on your international experience, you know, are there, I mean, have you been in environments where we've had this kind of one-way consultations where there's been this dramatic a change in terms of guidelines, where there's no opportunity for stakeholders to really get at the table and to not just be sort of an advisory body to respond to what you're saying, but to actually have input in terms of saying, not only what should the guidelines look like, but how should they be implemented? I mean, should we just actually, I mean, based on what you're saying, Sandy, should we just actually do this as a shadow for, you know, take the drugs as they're coming in for a year, let's look at what that impact might be, but let's not actually implement it. And then we can see what the impact might be. I don't know, but I'm just wondering, Barb, you know, from, you know, more of an international perspective, you know, does this happen everywhere?
Dramatic changes like the one envisioned here are relatively rare and few in between. There have been some big ones, you know, over the years. Now, when Germany put in its AMNOC system, that was a huge change. I'd say the challenge that I fear for, you know, my Canadian colleagues on the affiliate side is that there's more of a chance, even within a system like that, to negotiate, to really negotiate. Whereas in the Canadian system, we're divided into these, you know, separate puddles that don't really speak to each other. They're trying to improve that, but they will admit themselves that they are constrained by their rules and regulations to really negotiate with you. And so my fear is that with the change in clinical trial design needed for oncology products coming through, pretty much every scientific expert admits that we can't have the same rules that used to apply for the cardiovascular trials, but we really lack that flexibility to negotiate. So even NHS in the UK, so it's sort of a mentor for the type of evaluations that Canada does. Even there, they have put in a lot of flexible arrangements to have those discussions to get around, these issues. So they have different thresholds, they have different weights for qualities, and they'll even do some surprising deals out of the blue, where, for example, they took on a new PCSK9 inhibitor even before EMA approval. They've got a deal. It's probably a pretty great deal. We don't know the deal. And it's very difficult to see how my Canadian colleagues are going to facilitate that kind of creative, everybody wins solution in this environment.
And I'll pass it over to some other people. Your last comment, though, really kind of hits home, and that is everybody wins. We have seen in Canada gotten to a winners losers, and till the PMPRB wins and the patients lose, the clinicians lose, the researchers lose, is how we've set it up. And unfortunately, we're not making the rules. So I think that's the other thing, the people that get to, call the shots on this seem to be not, in a position of listening. I guess I'm going to go back and make a plea and maybe open up to other people, though. Where the heck are my politicians? Why are they not stepping in and basically saying patients are at risk here? We need to listen. We need to actually be in a much more, consultative process and really understand that these risks that we're talking about, we're not just crying wolf. We're not just basically raising this. We are very much at risk. And I don't understand why, our elected leaders are not really taking the time to understand what that impact is and really listen to people, to try to come up with some alternatives that could make, as you're saying, Barb, everybody a winner. We all have to win in this. Otherwise, nobody wins in it.
So I'll just quickly jump in. One of the problems might be that the PMPRB runs webinars and throws numbers out that would paint the picture as the worst case scenario. And I'll go back briefly to the slide that they showed on cystic fibrosis drugs. I mean, if you add up all the patient population that could potentially be getting the new medicines, and then they use the US list price, and they basically said, look, we're going to sell more of this one drug than we sold of Lipitor in 2010, which was at the time the biggest drug ever globally. And it becomes either a battle of the data and making the sky is falling case that we need to do something radical in terms of ratcheting down the prices, versus having a real dialogue. And I want to quickly shout out to the well over 100 people on the line now. Please use this question panel over here. The point on the patient population was actually brought forward by somebody there. Jump in. And Durhan, hats off to Cord to encourage forums like this for real roundtables and actual discussions as opposed to broadcast. So maybe there's two things. One, let's ratchet down the rhetoric a bit, and that would be one thing. And two, let's get around some real data in terms of how things actually work in the real world, so that it's about, and you often say this, how can we get to yes? How can we build a system that is about access and not about just saying no access? And that's and thank you, Sandy. You're signing off. It was great to have you get back to your patients. But how can we do that? And then maybe it's back to Durhan or anyone on the panel, both on the data and the how to actually talk to each other, because I think there's something missing there.
Well, let's move it back to Lindy, because I think, you're also helping on, trying to bridge that gap, right, between what it is that the industry is trying to do in terms of bringing these in. I mean, we all need to ensure that we're not going to be paying excess. Nobody in Canada wants to be paying more for drugs than we need to. On the other hand, we need to make sure that we're going to be paying at a reasonable price that we'll be able to bring these in as quickly as possible. I mean, Catherine made that point, crystal clear. If I don't get them, in a timely fashion, I might as well not get them. So what are you seeing as in terms of moving forward?
I think there has to be a way for us to be able to acknowledge that we should collaborate to ensure that our fellow Canadians continue to have access to the drugs that will give them the best possible health, physical function, lifespan, etc. You know, they've been dealt genetic cards that the rest of us don't have, and the thought of not having access to these new medications breaks my heart. I think if we can come together in a multi-stakeholder way to develop consensus on the methods that could be applied, at the end of the day, that the objective is to make sure we're not paying too much, as you just said, Durhan. We don't want to be the lowest, we don't want to be the highest. I think it's reasonable to land somewhere in the middle, and we need to look at what, let's in a fair manner, let's look at what are the costs going to be in the future. Let's not hide behind anything. Let's address it, but also put those costs into perspective to what we're paying elsewhere. So I think I mentioned before, staggering numbers. Canadians have made the decision that they would like to spend certain amounts on luxury goods. You know, if there was some creative way to present a case for funding of drugs for rare diseases in light of what Canadians are already spending for non-essential items, I think the conversation would change, and I think we wouldn't be so afraid of these, quote, high-cost drugs. I think there's ways in the system to disinvest, to get rid of some waste, avoid duplication of effort. There's some pooling that can take place, as has been happening in the private sector. Is there a way that we can tackle much more expensive healthcare issues? You know, if you were to reduce obesity by 10%, that's a savings, annual savings of $600 million. At today's figures for drugs for rare disease costs, that could easily fund 3 times or well, at least double the number of drugs that we have now, just with a small change in obesity. So I really think that we can come together in a collaborative manner to ensure that Canada's ideals of universal healthcare and caring for all are upheld. I'm sure there are regulations and practices that can be put in place to make sure that our fellow citizens with rare diseases and with rare cancers are not further disadvantaged relative to the rest of our society and to in comparison with citizens of other countries.
Barbara, do you share that? I mean, that's an amazing vision. Thank you, Lindy. And we're going to talk about webinar 3 in a second, because this is a great segue there. Barbara, do you see that there being an opportunity for that? As Dr. Sadeb said, it seems like they're going to, break the system, see what happens, and then dial it back. Is there an opportunity between now and January 1st to prevent that from happening and lives from being lost or people being hurt?
Yeah, I do think there is an opportunity. I think one good thing about PMPRB process is, as I understand it, you're able to consult with them in advance. So if there's a product that you're bringing down the pipe, get in there and consult. Now, I have to say that having been on the pharma side for decades, there's a certain reluctance in pharma to get out there and do some pre-consultation, because they're worried, data may change and they may get stuck on something. And anyway, do they really get good advice? But I've seen that changing dramatically over time. There's many more early consultations that are being done in Europe with UNEDA and EMA. It becomes standard in some companies to be doing these early consultations. And I think that's what Canada has to do. So this requires, though, that you have to pre-guess your clinical trial results, which is not as hard as you think, because you've done all your statistics to deliver a certain result, and you take that estimated result, because that's going to be success, and you want to launch with that kind of data, and you go in and investigate. I don't think PMPRB wants failure here either. I think they want some of these products to get in at a fair price. So for example, there's a very complex system in Germany called the AMNOG, and being in mental health, you know, we were subject to you know, that system and not getting products through. Diabetes products also were not getting through as well. However, very recently they did something quite interesting, where Bluebird Bio with gene therapy for beta thalassemia has sick funds actually paying for it now. And it was because the system somehow became flexible in that instance for an obvious win-win. And the win-win is that they'll pay for the first infusion and only for the subsequent infusions if the beta thalassemia patient does not require a transfusion. So they're saving them from transfusion. So I think there's many instances in the rare disease. I think government is a little bit afraid that the outcomes are not that measurable, but I don't think that's the case. I think the outcomes can be measurable, but the challenge for my Canadian colleagues, is they have to have a flexible dialogue, an evolving dialogue. It can't be like a one-off, you present your stuff, go away. You have to be able to solve the problems. So maybe one province has a particular issue. How do you solve that? Like when we were launching globally, we always had different issues in different countries. And so we would come with different solutions for the different issues in the different countries. If you do an HTA review, you'll see, you know, Germany didn't like it for this reason, or France didn't like it for a completely separate reason. And you have that in Canada. You'll have all the different actors will have different objections, different reasons, and you have to have a more fluid way of understanding those early so that you can evolve the solutions. So that's a long way of saying early dialogue and more continuous dialogue could solve the problem.
And thanks for that, Barb. We're actually past 1, so I'm recognizing people's time, but this is such a good conversation, and you've been such good roundtable participants that, Durhan, can we go on for an extra couple of minutes in your opinion? Are you okay with that?
You know what, I'd like to respect people's time. I know people have to go. So I know even though we've got a great dialogue going on, I'm always afraid that, you know, we'll get people just drifting off. So, you know, I mean, I'm sure the panelists, you know, we can continue to have the dialogue, but, you know, my concern is that, you know, we're not going to necessarily be able to get to, you know, a good spot anyway in terms of ending the discussion. Though I will say this has been a tremendous conversation, and I wish that we really should, you know, try to do these over a longer period of time. And maybe we can, what I'd like to do is just maybe talk, Bill, about where we're going next and how we'd like to do this. And because I may give us a bit of where we're heading and how we want to do this. So we will have one final panel on the 30th of July before the final recommendations go in. And not to say that people are going to scramble to change those, but we really do want to pick up exactly, I think, where this panel is, and that is what are the alternatives? And I think a lot of what Barb is saying as well is why do we need to have those flexibilities? Because that's the biggest problem right now with what PMPRB is proposing, is that they are draconian hard stops in terms of what the benchmarks and the cutoffs are going to be, which makes it very challenging in an environment where innovative medicines, high uncertainties, really do require flexibilities. So just to say quickly, our next panel is actually quite an exciting panel. And again, picking up a bit on what we've got here, we've got a couple of truly international perspectives. We will have Sheila, I always mess up her name, Upadhyaya, who is the lead for the highly specialized therapies for NICE, who will be on the panel. We will have Patricia Danson, who is the Professor Emeritus at Wharton School of Business, who will be one of the panelists. And we will have Rosalie Wyonk, who is with the CD Howe, who will be another one of the panelists, much more inside of Canada. We're going to invite one of the industry leads who are going to be able to provide us with a reality perspective on this and be able to really talk about what are the alternatives then? Why is it we need the flexibility? And again, picking up on what both Lindy and Barbara were talking about, why do we need some modifiers in terms of these rules? Why can we not, why is it so dangerous to just have these kinds of rigid cutoffs that are being proposed here under the PMPRB? And how can we do differently? How can we do better? I'm anticipating, and Bill, we haven't talked about this yet, is that even after we've kind of submitted our submissions into CATA, there really will be an implementation period. And we really will need to continue this kind of dialogue, because we have not really come to the point where I think we need to be, and that is, what are the alternatives in the implementation? What else needs to be done between now and January the 1st in order to ensure that as these guidelines are being implemented, they're going to be implemented in a fashion that, they're going to work for the patients, going to work for the industry, going to work for the payer. So I really will say is that we need to stay tuned to this space, and I'd love to have everybody that's on here come back, and maybe we can, really have some broader, discussions around it, because we do need to get to a place where I think we're all, in Barb's here, where we've got a win-win solution. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So just to alert people that we've got one more session coming up, and I think it's a stellar lineup, and I think we'll be able to further this discussion, in that webinar. But probably we'll be looking at some further discussions as we transition from summer into looking at the implementation.
So let's close it out, but I didn't give Catherine a second word. Are you more optimistic or less optimistic after this session, Catherine? Up or down? Are we trending more? I mean, it helps when we're all around the table like this. Last word to you.
Get it right. Don't screw this up.
Wow, so the spotlight's on. I'm optimistic about what everyone here is saying. I don't know if I'm confident that people on the PMPRB are really understanding what we're saying. So I'm hopeful, but I'm still worried.
Thank you. And thank you, Lindy, for all the data, for Barbara, for the global perspective, and Durhan. I mean, this has been an amazing ride. On day to day, we're, as you said, we're learning more every time we do this kind of thing. And I hope that the 100+ people that logged in are getting this as well. There's going to be a follow-up email that everyone's going to get. These slides are going to be available on SlideShare, and that'll be part of a link that all the participants, and even those that didn't come on, will actually get access to. So thank you very much for your time. Stay safe, be well, and I hope to see you all soon when we can actually see each other properly. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.